It's my pleasure to thank you on behalf of Faculty Forward, the sponsors of the event. It's a campus group, but also a statewide group that's organizing, plugged into a national network of Faculty Forward. We want to get people talking about the way UNC is increasingly relying on contingent adjunct professors who are often underpaid and often underappreciated, as I'm sure some of you in this room know even better than I do. In North Carolina and across the country, faculty are joining together to push for better working conditions, for transparency, for more faculty voice, and also to defend education, to defend higher education. Like many other faculty, I joined Faculty Forward so I could participate in a movement that's having a positive influence on higher education. Here on my campus, and where I've worked for 21 years, and I'm tenured, by the way, I'm an ally, and around the country. I think it's an important effort and that there's a lot of potential for making positive change. In our state, this group, Faculty Forward, has already had a lot of impact. We've worked hard to increase awareness. We've reached out to community allies and campus allies. We're looking for creative solutions to protect the quality of education. We want to work with students, staff, community members, faculty members in all departments and from all backgrounds, and we hope each one of you who comes out will want to sign up for more information, to be involved with us, but to also come to meetings and think about how to be part of this movement, how you can contribute. It's kind of a timely topic that we have today, given the fact that right on campus, we learned yesterday that 40 workers over in Student Stores building, including those at the Bull's Head bookstore, went to a mandatory meeting with the Vice Chancellor of Finance, Matt Bajek, and he told them they were going to be getting pink slips and their jobs were going to be outsourced. So I just say, is this topic of disposability is really timely because I don't think anybody who's here wants to live in a world where we're all considered disposable people and disposable workers. I'm going to turn things over to our speaker, who's president of the AAUP at Appalachian State. He's in the history department, and he's going to speak outside of his professional expertise on this topic of disposable professors, contingent labor in the corporate university. I'll welcome Michael C. Behrent, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for having me. As Altha said, I'm a little bit new to this. It's the first time I've ever really sort of formally spoken about this topic. So I decided to handle it like a professor would. I've kind of put together a lecture, but that is going to try to present an overview of the topic. And without fail, though, I will try and sort of wrap up in 20-25 minutes so that there's time for discussion. Wherever I am in the presentation, we'll sort of stop at that point. First of all, am also part of Faculty Forward, and I think this is an extremely important and dynamic and sort of morally compelling movement. And I really do, the organizers have helped us, begin to set up a chapter on my campus. I know that they're doing that here and throughout the state, and I think it's a really important organization. They're really doing a good job, and I encourage you to get to know about it better and to start attending their meetings and find out what they're about. In terms of why I became involved in this issue, basically I think anyone who is a professor these days has almost necessarily gone through a stage of being contingent labor. It's part of the job right now. I fortunately did it under relatively decent conditions. But I did have 4 years being an adjunct professor at small liberal arts colleges in Ohio before I got my current position, which is tenure track, and I recently received tenure at Appalachian State. But I do know that the feeling of having those low paychecks, and in particular the kind of little humiliations that come with it, the fact that you're as qualified as everybody else, but you're somehow teaching more for less money. And also this was all before 2008, and I think I got my position in 2008. I think things have gotten worse since then. But I suppose in particular, I've really been sort of struck and moved and and appalled by the conditions of some of the adjunct faculty at my institution. I mean, it sounds like you're trying to sort of, tell a story of some sort of tearjerker movie when you talk about these things, if it wasn't for the fact that the stories are true. I have, excellent colleagues who've been teaching for over a decade as contingent faculty at Appalachian, who haven't been to a dentist in 10 years. I know one who had his number of courses cut so that the university would not have to give him benefits under the Affordable Care Act, and learned that not only would that mean that his paycheck would go down because he had fewer classes, but that the pro rate of his classes also goes down when the number of classes that you teach go down. I've talked to graduate students who teach so many classes across Western North Carolina at different schools, to sort of get to that number 8, which a lot of people seem to reach, that literally one of the classes that he is teaching basically goes to paying his gas money to get to the others. Okay, so I think it's that kind of situation that made me feel that this really is an important issue of our time, and maybe the most important issue of our time in higher education, with maybe the possible exception of student debt. But I think those two issues are perhaps the greatest, and probably are closely connected. So what I put together is a kind of presentation where I'm going to talk about a number of issues. We'll see how many I get to. I'm a historian. Sometimes I feel like I'm kind of a peculiar historian and not a sort of orthodox historian in terms of my interests, but I do sort of tend to think historically. So I tried to sort of think about, where did contingent labor come from? So I'm going to start with a brief history of contingent academic labor. And then the other things I hope to get to are sort of the story of the evolving awareness about contingency, the consequences of contingency, and some hard questions that this issue forces us to ask. So let's start with the history. A brief history of contingent academic labor. I guess one way that I would sort of tell the story, historians are always looking for stories of contingent academic labor in the United States, is to think about the fact that once upon a time, or we think of contingent labor as something new, but in fact we have to remember that once upon a time it was the model. The first contingent professors were the first professors in the United States. The story of the American university, if you look at its evolution from the late 18th century until really the late 19th century and early 20th century, basically all professors were to some extent contingent, meaning all professors essentially served at the will of their chairs, or in particular their presidents, who could often be fairly tyrannical. A sort of important early incident that is actually very important to the founding of the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, concerned an economist at Stanford University in the early years of that university's existence, named Edward Allsworth Ross, who had some sort of problematic political views, but who denounced the use of immigrant labor in the building of railroads, and this offended the sort of main donor of Stanford University, Jane Stanford, precisely because her money was railroad money, and the result was he got fired. And I think that is a certain form of, I think that's contingent. Okay, if you're dependent upon the whim of your employer and can be punished for saying things that you don't agree with, that's a form of contingency. But the story, of course, is what happens though to the American Academy for all kinds of complicated reasons I can't really go into, but I'm sure you're roughly familiar with. We have this what I'm calling sort of the interregnum, or the golden age of tenure, okay, where there is a pushback against that contingency. AAUP was a crucial actor in this, but other forces were at work as well. But basically, and there's certainly many things that we would not want to glorify about the mid-20th century American university, but there's certain things that they did achieve that I think are worth considering. PhD became the qualification for university positions. That probably happened a little bit earlier, more sort of in the early 20th century, but it became increasingly the norm by this period. And also tenure became the norm, which implied that you couldn't have the incidents that I just talked about, where professors essentially kind of serve in the lead of their presidents, but you have the sort of idea that if you do your job well for a certain probationary period, then you are entitled to that job unless you commit sort of some kind of grievous professional error, and the notion that that is decided by the professional evaluation of your peers. I mean, that's really what we call tenure, and there's some key AAUP documents in that. Another important component is shared governance, the idea that universities actually do their jobs better when faculty, meaning the people who are the university themselves, at least participating in governance, and in particular controlling the pedagogical agenda and research agenda of their institutions. And I think it's significant. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of make a, in any respect, kind of some sort of nationalistic comment, but I do think it's interesting that the sort of rise to global prominence of the American university is tied to this system, okay? It's really when academic freedom and shared governance become the norm in American universities, starting at the research universities, but then trickling down, that universities in the United States start to become world-class universities, competing with ones in Europe and elsewhere. But what happens, and what's interesting though, is, okay, so where's contingency in this? What is, I probably should have done this so that I could have asked you the question, but I didn't think to do the slide that way. But what is the percentage of faculty, what percentage of faculty were on full-time non-tenure track appointments? In other words, an important part of what we would call contingent labor in 1969, 3.3%. It's a tiny portion in 1969. So what happened, I would say, one way to sort of think about our current situation is that contingency has returned. Okay, we had a long period of contingency, a brief interregnum where we had sort of the golden age of tenure, but now contingency's back. Contingent appointments in particular rose in the 1970s and 80s. They really kind of explode in the 1990s and of course are continuing to do so. This is just to sort of look at a few sort of figures. This is the sort of level of non-tenured, off the tenure track appointments, sort of as percentage, I think, of total full-time appointments in the 1990s. Okay, this is when you have this kind of the moment really sort of when the percentage of contingent or non-tenure track faculty hit sort of the 50% point. This kind of, I won't sort of comment on it. This is another chart that sort of gives you a kind of sense of how it has continued to rise in the past 15 or 16 years, where you have relatively stable full-time tenured and tenure track faculty, but the sort of expansion really is almost all taking place at the level of various forms of contingent faculty. This is another chart just to kind of illustrate it. I realize that's a little bit bigger than what I was saying earlier, but I think that's probably including part-time as well as full-time tenure track. But a sort of fairly kind of negligible percent of non-tenure track or contingent labor in the late 60s compared to the moment, where I think the sort of standard term that we hear now is between 70 and 75% of academic labor is being done by people who are not on the tenure track, and that's contingent. So how did this happen? This is, I guess, sort of what I was trying to think about. Well, I'm going to explore a series of causes. Okay, so I'm just going to do the historian thing here for a moment. I think the first thing is what I would call, what I've sort of summed up as retrenchment, which really, and what I really mean by that is the 1970s moment in the history of academia. I think a lot of people sort of recognize that the 1970s is crucial for the new global economy that sort of began to take off, and some people call it neoliberalism. I'm sure you're roughly familiar with these arguments. But I think there's an academic version of this. And the term that sort of became kind of common to use in the academic discourse at this time is retrenchment. What's the situation in the 70s? In short, you have an economic crisis, this combination of stagnation and inflation, known as, at the time, the stagflation. You also have a problem of declining or stagnant enrollment in many universities, tied in particular to the fact that you kind of have an ebb of enrollments as the baby boom generation that flooded campuses in the 1960s starts to peter out. And so this means administrators start talking about retrenchment. This is actually a term that you find in the discourse. Another phrase that's kind of interesting is cutback management. In other words, the question of how do you manage poorer and smaller institutions. Sorry for the spelling mistakes. A few quotes that kind of illustrate this. This is an academic article from Public Administration Review. I'm sure you all sort of keep up with that. From 1978, where someone says, one of the most important factors in university planning today is the possible decrease in enrollment in the 1980s. Another quote, and this character, George Keller, is really kind of a key figure in the application of the management model, or the so-called business model, to universities. He says, this is the way he begins his book, with a reference that some of you might catch. A specter is haunting higher education, the specter of decline and bankruptcy. Experts predict that between 10% and 30% of America's 3,100 colleges and universities will close their doors or merge with other institutions by 1995. I think it's this context that really, of a kind of fear about revenue and enrollment, that sort of first starts to make the appeal to contingent labor as opposed to tenure labor appealing. Another factor is this is a little more complicated, but what I would simply call a more unpredictable educational environment, a kind of riskier educational environment compared to the more stable period of the post-war decades. A couple of things that are sort of fairly technical but are not sort of minor. There's a problem of less predictable faculty retirements tied to a number of federal laws that come into existence in the late 70s and 80s that basically, at a certain point, the long and short of it is mandatory retirement for professors ends, which makes it much more difficult for departments, according to one account, to sort of predict their needs in terms of teaching staffing, and that makes short-term contracts and contingent labor more appealing. There's also changing patterns in student enrollment. In particular, you see the rise of so-called non-traditional students and the increasingly important role that they play in universities in this period. College enrollment increased 54% from 70 to 1990, but 80% of that was, of the increase, was students 35 and older. And as one scholar about this has said, the unpredictable enrollment patterns of non-traditional students make non-tenure track positions as a flexible resource more appealing to institutions. There's also new competitors for students, and the short version of this is the arrival on the scene, to some extent, the increasing importance of community colleges, but really the advent of the for-profit sector, which is something that you don't really have in the post-war decades, but that starts to happen, really sort of beginning in the 1980s and especially the 1990s. It's not a huge percentage of all undergraduates. It's only 9% in 2009, but that's compared to 2% in 1990. These are sort of similar figures. Technology, I'm going to mention, but I'm not going to comment on because I think it's obvious how that sort of opens the door to the use of contingent faculty. So I'll let you just kind of fill in the blank in that one. And then I think also sort of crucially, declining government support. And just to sort of take a look at how these sort of figures actually play out. I actually couldn't find sort of one graph that kind of aggregated all the sort of total state contributions and how those have evolved over this period. But it seems that you kind of have the first sort of serious halt of government support in the early 1990s. The first state funding decrease for higher education in nearly 33 years occurred in I think in the context of the recession of the early 1990s. The first two-year decrease in higher education and living memory occurred the following year. And it's around this time that the proportion of full-time instructional faculty begins to decline significantly. And if you look at sort of charts, you'll get a sort of sense of it. This is funding information for the state of California from 1967 to 2001. Again, I couldn't find it for all states, but this kind of gives you an idea. This is the percent of the higher education share of state general fund expenditures, and you're sort of looking at kind of, sort of 17, 18 in the late 60s and in the early 1970s, and declining significantly here. I guess this is sort of Jerry Brown which I guess is a good thing, but it's still sort of not that dramatic. This is another chart that's sort of worth looking at. It's not very readable from here. It's from the Center for Budget Policy and Priorities. It sort of shows the kind of dramatic decline in state spending per student from 2008. From 2008 to 2013. And you can see that in some states, Arizona, New Hampshire, it's really kind of staggering. North Carolina, I was surprised, is actually not quite as bad as other places, but perhaps that is a reminder of that things can still get worse.
Oh, I'm sorry, we can't read that slide. What were the lines?
This is the percent change in state spending per student from 2008 to 2013. The New York, it's not New York, the North Carolina Policy Watch or whatever that's called. They published this chart actually, so you can find it there, and I'm happy to sort of make it available to anyone afterwards. So I wanted to sort of make sure I say something about corporatization. And so what is corporatization? Well, this is a pretty good definition, although I don't think it would surprise anyone from a useful article on this topic. Corporatized university is defined as an institution that is characterized by the processes, decisional criteria, expectations, organizational culture, and operating practices that are taken from and have their origins in modern business corporation. It is characterized by the entry of the university into marketplace relationships and by the use of market strategies in university decision making. And I guess what corporatization means for contingency is that, this sort of scholar sort of says it, that with the growing ranks of part-timers, contingent labor, and teaching assistants, the academy is following the corporate model of employing just-in-time labor as flexible, fluid, and disposable low-cost income forces. And I'm going to sort of skip this one because I want to sort of move towards the discussion pretty soon, but the John Sexton, president of NYU, I think sort of has a kind of revealing document from 2004 where he kind of presented the mission of NYU, which is really kind of one of the worst offenders, even though that's where I got my PhD, in terms of kind of applying the corporate model to education. But he sort of, in his kind of grand vision, sort of specifically lays out a kind of tiered faculty. There's the kind of core tenure faculty, who are going to be sort of the crucial draw to the university. Although they don't, even under his vision, they don't get too much shared governance. Then you have the teaching faculty, and he says things like, the future will see more of this, but they don't have tenure or academic freedom. And he says, this is the kind of, sort of corporate spin on contingent labor. Everyone will have a role and respect, but that does not mean everybody will have the same rights and responsibilities. You can tell he's a visionary, right? And I guess the way that I would make sense of this, what is the sort of relationship between corporatization and contingency? I think it's important to sort of see that I don't think contingent labor starts with corporatization. Okay, I think it's important to see that contingency really is a kind of ad hoc solution that universities, and in particular public universities, adopt in the 1970s to deal with the economic crisis sort of as applied to higher education. But what sort of happened is this created an opportunity for people who embrace applying a business model to education to sort of sell their wares and to have their way. I think that is kind of what has happened. And it sort of reminds me of the argument made by Naomi Klein in her famous book, The Shock Doctrine, where she kind of argues this has sort of been the model that in many countries free marketeers have sort of adopted to sort of implement their ideas. You have a serious economic crisis, and then that creates an opportunity to sort of implement these ideas. I do need to wrap up soon, keeping my eye on the time. I had a couple things to say about the culture of contingency, which is kind of interesting, how it's sort of become part of it. But let me just make sure, I'm not going to have a chance to sort of make these points in any depth, but I just want to make sure that I mention some of them to you, and then maybe that can be part of our discussion. What are the consequences of contingency? There's a lot that can be said about that. I think one is deprofessionalization. That contingent labor undermines the defining elements of academic professionalism. That interwar period, that post-World War II period was really about a serious professionalization. With all the pros and some of the cons that come with that of the American professoriate. That's what's being challenged. Okay, our profession is being deprofessionalized. If you have a situation where people aren't being peer evaluated, where the traditional importance of the PhD is in decline, the connection between scholarship and teaching is undermined, and even tenure itself is being sort of abolished in a kind of roundabout way, we're being deprofessionalized. There's other important consequences as well. First of all, and this is something I think is probably the most visceral for many people, just the sense that academic departments aren't equal. They never were exactly, but tenure sort of created at least a kind of, sort of equality at kind of the vanishing point, that was achieving tenure, or the promise of tenure. Now, you really kind of have sort of increasingly kind of a caste system in the sense that people almost can't move from one group to the next. Declining educational standards, and this is controversial. This is not to say that contingent faculty are poor teachers, but the positions in which they are placed, the resources that they are given, the structure of their employment is such that it really is, it's really difficult to say that that recourse to contingent has the best interests of education in mind. AUP has what I think is a really brilliant point. I will mention this one. Yeah. And even as far back as '86, they said, we question whether the intellectual mission of a university is well served when the institution asserts that certain basic courses are indispensable for a liberal education, but then assigns responsibility for those courses to the faculty who are deemed replaceable and unnecessary to the institution. Briefly, you also have weaker academic freedom with contingency for the same reason that AUP wanted tenure in the first place, which is that if people know that they can be fired for what they say, then they're going to be less likely to speak their mind. You also have weaker shared governance because the exclusion of these people, the contingent faculty from such institutions. There's a couple of hard questions that I wanted to sort of throw out there, but I might just sort of